Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Museum After Hours. I'm Trey Johnson, and tonight we're joined by Chris Pascal. Pascal is a professor and accountant from Long Island. Since 2023, he's been a PhD student of history at Stony Brook University. His dissertation research focuses on the land treaties between the Kaw tribe and the U.S. government from 1825 to 1902. Prior to entering the field of accounting, he was a combat engineer in the U.S. Marine Corps and served in Fallujah in 2005. The focus of tonight's presentation will be on Kansas's cursed Senate seat. It started with James Lane, one of our first two senators, who ended the position after publicly shooting himself in the head. Some senators in this specific seat left the office in great shame, and it took 30 years for one to serve even a single term. Charles Curtis served a full term but lost in a primary 6 years later. He'd won 10 elections but couldn't even get renominated into this dastardly seat. Pascal will take us through this incredible story from its beginning with James Lane and up to the point where it found stability under Arthur Capper. We'll have a brief question and answer period after the program, so be sure to enter your questions into the Q&A feature or the chat, and we will get to as many as we can. So with that, I am pleased to welcome Chris Pascal.
Trey, thank you so much, and I'm so happy to be here to share this research. I'm going to share my screen to pull up the presentation. I wanted to say that I'm also thrilled that there are so many people here from different places. I know that there are friends of mine here from as far east as New York and Florida, as far west as California. I know someone's here from Iowa. I'm very, very pleased, and I thank you all for being here. Thank you so much. Getting to this talk, the profound history of Kansas's cursed Senate seat, from James Lane to Roger Marshall. The topics to be covered tonight are the history of the Senate seat, the senators who were elected and appointed, and the deeper analysis into this. Now, U.S. senators from Kansas were first elected with statehood in 1861, and the job of a U.S. senator is said to be the best in national public office. They hold the seat for 6 years. There's only 100 of them today. Back during this time, that there were less because there weren't 50 states. Unlike being a congressman, you're not constantly in cycles of running for re-election. A congressman has to run every other year, and so they're always running for office. Our current senators in these seats are Roger Marshall on the left and James Moran. Roger Marshall is in the cursed Senate seat right now. The first senators were James Lane on the left, on the bottom, and Samuel Pomeroy. Now, during this time, from 1861 to 1919, it is less than 10 Senate terms, under 60 years. They went through 13 senators, and there were 2 deaths, 4 accusations of criminal activity, 2 of which were proven, 5 periods of vacancy, and only 1 incumbent senator won re-election out of all 13 senators, only 1 was re-elected. And when we compare this to the other Senate seat occupied first by Samuel Pomeroy, there were 7 senators, no deaths, and I say 0 disgraces. Let's replace that with 0 public disgraces. Now we start with James Lane. James Lane had been the lieutenant governor of Indiana, as well as a US congressman. After voting for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, seeing that the fight for the very soul of Kansas was beginning, he immediately relocates to Kansas, and many people considered him the commander of the Free State Army. In 1855, he oversees the Topeka Constitutional Convention, and that helps make the pre-state territory of Kansas an anti-slavery territory. 3 years after the convention, he's in a land dispute in the city of Lawrence. He is shot, he shoots back, returns fire, kills his attacker. In 1861, with statehood, he's elected to be the first senator. However, he's not in the office for very long because the Civil War begins, and he forms up to lead a group called the Jayhawkers. A lot of our friends in Kansas tonight, they're familiar with the Jayhawkers. Those outside might not know. They were policing and patrolling the eastern border, but they were also going in and doing a lot more. Just specifically talking about James Lane, It would be generous to say that he led the Jayhawkers with mixed reviews. A lot of his work dealt with burning, pillaging, murdering, and plundering. The main criticism, if he was to receive an annual review, was that his boss told him, if you keep all the murdering and pillaging and plundering up, the neutral and pro-union Missourians might not feel neutral or pro-union anymore. And I would like to address the idea of plunder, because in a time of war, an invading army may plunder for reasonable causes, like taking a hog to feed the men. But there was one instance where James Lane had a wagon full of silks and gold and a piano. And silks during winter, perhaps. Gold, a piano, no. This is not the Crusades. That you're not plundering for profit to come away from saving the homeland. Following this time, we have a period called the Lawrence Massacre, where William Quantrill and some guerrillas come to Lawrence, Kansas. Among their mission, they burn a lot of homes. They kill about 200 men. They specifically want the head of James Lane. He hides from them, and he manages to get away. Later in the Civil War, he leads the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry in a battle of Island Mound in Missouri in October of 1862. James Lane was a big believer that Black soldiers could be effective and find victory, and that they would help the Union greatly. In this skirmish, he was outnumbered 2-1, and the Black soldiers had won with 225 against 500. Following this, we had a lot of Black units form up, such as the 54th Massachusetts, which was popularized in a film called Glory, starring Denzel Washington and Matthew Broderick. In 1864, he's in the Battle of Westport under the leadership of Samuel Curtis. Now, General Curtis was working to turn the tide of a series of battles called the Missouri Expedition. And had General Curtis lost, the Confederacy would have crossed the border from Kansas City, Missouri, to what was then called the city of Kansas, Kansas. They were able to hold them off. And the reason I mentioned so much about James Lane, he is in a land dispute. He goes to war where he is a war criminal. He is also a war hero. Despite all of these things, the war ends. He goes back to the Senate. He's accused of financial irregularities. And on a public street, he cannot take it. He shoots himself in the head. And 10 days later, he dies. Replacing him is Edmund Ross. Edmund Ross turns out to be the final tie-breaking vote in the impeachment of President Johnson replaced Abraham Lincoln, and he was impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. When Edmund Ross breaks the tie and does not prosecute President Johnson, he is later accused of bribery. Those accusations have no evidence that was found against him, but regardless, when it was time to put up a new candidate for the Republicans, they did not choose Edmund Ross for re-election. Next, we have Alexander Caldwell. Caldwell had made a fortune selling supplies to Union camps during the Civil War. He's a successful businessman. He's very knowledgeable about how railroads work. And he'd even served in the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. Now, to run for senator unopposed, he wanted to use some of his best practices. So he bribed other people not to run. It's a great way to get a contract as a military supplier, but it's also a sure way to get your butt kicked out of political office. And so during the course of the investigation, they're trying to figure out, well, did he really bribe anyone? And Kansas's second governor, Thomas Kearny, says, yes, I accepted $15,000 in cash from him to not run against him. So the Republican Party forces Caldwell to resign, and Thomas Kearny gives him a job as president of his bank, the First National Bank of Leavenworth. He is replaced with the appointment of Robert Crozier, who is a former Kansas Supreme Court Chief Justice and also an employee of Thomas Kearny's at the First National Bank of Leavenworth. Seeing this 4 months later, he is then replaced by Governor, former Governor James Harvey. James Harvey fulfills the end of the term, but he does no more. And now we come to Preston Plumb. Preston Plumb is the 6th senator to fill this seat. He is the first to fulfill a full 6-year term, but he also died while sitting in it. Preston Plumb came to Kansas as a boy, and at the age of 20, he served as the secretary of the Free State Convention in 1857. He was a member of the Leavenworth Constitutional Convention, and he was elected to the Kansas House of Representatives before the Civil War. During the Civil War, he serves in the infantry and the cavalry, goes from lieutenant to lieutenant colonel, and later, after the war, he is elected again to the Kansas House of Representatives, where he becomes Speaker of the House. He co-founds the city of Emporia and becomes the president of the Emporia National Bank. And eventually, he is elected to the United States Senate. He is the first to serve a full term, the first to win re-election, and at the age of 54, he suffers a massive stroke and he dies very suddenly. He is the appointment to replace him is Bishop Perkins. Bishop Perkins is a 4-term US Congressman, and he is not doing a bad job, but we have something that happens in Kansas in the early 1890s. And that leads to the legislature replacing him in an election before an election year. Before the Senate term was up, the Kansas majority was flipped to a new party, the Tea Party, which was called the Populist Party. And they supported a fusion candidate named John Martin, who was considered to be a populist Democrat. Kansas didn't just flip its legislature. It had a new governor who was populist, and 6 of its 8 US congressmen were from the Populist Party. Additionally, in the 1892 presidential election, the state voted for a third-party candidate, James Weaver, under the Populist Party. This helps Grover Cleveland get elected with a Democratic majority in the House and the Senate. Now, the Populists' big concern was that the value of a dollar was causing inflation to make it harder to get by for the average person. And this is particularly concerning for farmers, young people, the poor, and Black voters who come up in the 1870s, 1880s to have a better life. The Populists published a lot of books and articles, and many of them were about how the economy was on the verge of collapse. And the biggest problem populists might have had, and the biggest problem for John Martin, was that they might have been right. Because right as the Cleveland administration begins, we suffer the worst depression that the United States has ever seen. It lasts for 4 years. Wheat falls by about 25%. The price of wheat falls by about 25%. Now, that's really great if you're buying bread. It's really not that great if you just took out a business loan to sell bread. Farmers couldn't pay their loans. Banks weren't getting paid. Businesses began shutting down because they had less access to credit. This led to more unemployment, which meant more loans to banks couldn't get paid. And then there was a bank shutdown because it ran out of money, which led to a panic, which caused runs on hundreds of banks that shut down. Those banks shutting down led to more unemployment and also more poverty as people lost their deposits, which led to more banks shutting down. And so we get down to the end of this, and after all this turmoil, people really just want to go back to the good old times. They want to go back to when things were good, and so they bring back a Republican majority in the state of Kansas. And these Republicans bring back a standard Republican, Lucian Baker. Lucian Baker is the 9th senator in this seat, and he is the 2nd to serve a full term. His background is that he's a lawyer, and he'd also served as a state senator. While in the US Senate, he chaired the Committee on Civil Service. However, he was not renominated. And then we have Joseph Burton. Joseph Burton was known in Kansas as a boss buster. See, Kansas Republicans had spent years under the leadership of a political boss named Cyrus Leland Jr. Leland had a lot of influence in who held office around the state and in Washington, but younger politicians, like Burton, wanted to relieve him of this responsibility, partly because he constantly undermined the process of a Republican government. Leland was not just heavy-handed, but extremely petty. The list of hilarious and ridiculous stories that I've come across just peripherally in other research really could fill a talk all its own. But getting back to Joseph Burton, what we need to know is this. Burton's background is that he was a lawyer. He served in the Kansas House of Representatives. Now, as he becomes a U.S. Senator, one of the things he realizes is being a senator is really expensive. You're supporting a household on the East Coast as well as back in Kansas. However, just as when he was in the Kansas House of Representatives, he can work as a lawyer. So he's approached by a get-rich-quick scheme that's being investigated by the U.S. Post Office, and they ask him if he will help them with the investigation. Specifically, they want him to stop the investigation. He agrees to do it for a fee of $500 a month. Now, the assistant U.S. Postmaster General at this time is a political ally of the boss, Cyrus Leland. And so 2.5 years into his Senate term, he's indicted by a grand jury for having interfered with the U.S. mail. While on this time, he is told to stay out of the Senate. He's still a senator, but he has to stay out of the Senate. He's not supposed to vote. He's not supposed to work on any kind of legislation. There is an exception where they bring him in because they need his vote, and he is still a senator. But he's essentially just sitting around waiting for trial. About a year later, he goes to trial in court in Washington, D.C. They find him guilty, sentence him to 6 months in Ironton Prison in Missouri, and fine him $2,500. Now, Burton appeals this. He doesn't appeal on the basis that he didn't do it. He appeals it on the fact that he didn't do it in Washington, D.C. And they agree. He did not commit this crime in Washington, D.C., and he sits around for another year waiting for a trial in St. Louis. In St. Louis, he's found guilty. He's sentenced to 6 months in prison in Ironton in Missouri and has to pay a $2,500 fine. He appeals again to the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court agrees to hear his case, and nearly 6 years into his time as senator, he resigns after he is found guilty and sent to prison. They do not take away his law license. He practices law for the rest of his career. And I would like to say that, contrary to all of this, while Burton is taking a fee of $500 a month to represent alleged scam artists, the other senator from Kansas at this time, the one in the good seat, is documented to have taken about $100,000 from various concerns to influence his state convention. But as I noted in the introduction, there were no revealed disgraces in the other Senate seat. Joseph Burton is the first senator in U.S. history to be convicted of a crime while in office. Just as he resigns, the U.S. Senate is about to go into recess. Before they go into recess, they swear in Alfred Benson. Alfred Benson is he was a Civil War veteran. He had risen from the rank of private to major. He spent 4 years in the Kansas State Senate and 2 years as a state court judge. So he misses the long session. He's there just in time to be sworn in. And then, right as the short session's about to begin, which goes from December to March, the new legislature is going to vote on who is going to be the next senator. 5 people put themselves into the running. There's 2 sitting congressmen, the state speaker of the House, a former U.S. senator who wants to run again, and Alfred Benson. One of the congressmen approaches Benson with a deal. And the deal is this. He says, Benson, you're going to lose, and I'm going to win. So what do you say? You drop out and tell everyone you support me, and then I will let you be a senator for a season. You can finish out the short session. So and he says, and if you don't agree, I'm going to beat you, and then I'm going to make it that I get to step in mid-session and you don't get to be a senator at all. So here we have Judge Benson is made this offer to die like a man or roll over like a dog. And he agrees to die like a man, and keeping his promise, Charles Curtis makes him move out. The legislature installs him in January instead of in March. And here we talk about Curtis. Curtis is a 7-term congressman at this point, and in taking this seat, he becomes the second Native American in history to ever become a U.S. senator. The first is Hiram Revels from Mississippi in 1870, and the only current one that we have serving today is Mark Wayne Mullins in Oklahoma. Curtis enters the Senate, and we have the Panic of 1907. What we need to know about Curtis's time in office related to the Panic of 1907 is that he first becomes a congressman in 1893, right as we had the largest depression the country had ever seen. So when the Panic of 1907 starts, there is a 3-week stock market plunge where the index drops to about half of its 52-week high. And this is mostly due to investors who were gambling with borrowed money and losing, which led to loan defaults and a series of bank failures. Now, to stem the tide that was going to wash out these failing banks, as well as all the depositors who had savings and who had done nothing wrong, the Senate decides to form a central bank. A central bank had been in service back in 1836 before President Jackson had done away with it, and now they have it again. So the economy recovers, things seem fine. Curtis is no longer a congressman. He doesn't have to return to Kansas every 6 months or a year to shake hands and raise money for his elections. He gets to sit back and actually work on some legislation. As the election of 1912 is coming around, he is asking for reports from these established Curtis clubs back in Kansas. And he's asking them, he says, hey, I know I need to get back there, but how are things on the ground? And back at the Curtis clubs, they keep saying, it's great, Chief. Everything's fine. You're totally getting reelected. Now, if you think about it, not very hard, if you were sitting in a place called a Curtis club, you probably think everyone likes Charles Curtis and he has nothing to worry about. But these Curtis clubs were mostly set around only the 1st District of Kansas, where he'd been a congressman. And so these Curtis clubs are in a place like Shawnee County, where he grew up and where his grandfather had founded the city of North Topeka. Of course, things seem pretty great. And he keeps asking for reports, and he keeps getting really positive reports, and he's delaying going back to the state to campaign. What happens for the Republican primary around this time is that they change the rules on how the primary is going to run. It used to be that there was a convention that might put someone forth, or that would put someone forth. Now they want to do a hybrid of representative government based on popular voting. Just like how the legislature is full of legislators who will represent those who voted for them. They work in Topeka. They probably all know Charles Curtis personally. Now, instead, each county is going to hold its own popular vote. Whoever wins the county gets 1 vote in the primary. Charles Curtis is going to do great in the 1st district, maybe even a couple of other districts. But there's a lot of counties out in the western part of the state where they don't really know him. Entering the primary contest against him is Walter Stubbs, who's the governor of Kansas. Walter Stubbs can use his business as governor to very reasonably head out west and pick up all those counties while he campaigns to be a U.S. senator. When Curtis finally gets back to Kansas, he realizes he's really behind, and he ends up losing the primary. And it brings us to the election of 1912. Now, for this Senate seat, we have Judge William Thompson, versus Governor Walter Stubbs. But what's going on in the bigger picture is that Theodore Roosevelt has just formed a new party called the Progressive Party, sometimes called the Bull Moose Party. A big reason he did this is because he's mad at William Howard Taft. You see, Roosevelt wanted to honor the two terms as established by President Washington. And while he hadn't served a full 2 terms, he thought that he could do the half term he had when he took over for President McKinley after his assassination, plus the one he'd gotten in 1904. And then he brought up and molded William Howard Taft in his image. Now, the big problem with William Howard Taft is that he has a mind of his own. I mean, that's great for a Supreme Court justice, but that's really not very good for a puppet. And so, as a result, Theodore Roosevelt doesn't just bring in candidates. He's not just a candidate for president. He has all these other candidates for all these other offices. And a lot of strong Republicans move with him into the Progressive Party. Mind you, this was not a progressive wing of the Republican Party. It was a brand new third party. Republican votes are split in many races. Democratic votes are not. And in the state of Kansas, they flip the legislature and the Senate to the Democratic Party. As a result, with 49% of the popular vote and about 100% of the legislature vote, William Thompson becomes the second Democrat in the history of this seat to be elected to it. Also during this time in 1912, there was a state ballot measure for women's suffrage. Just as about 49% of people voted for William Thompson, about 49% of people voted for women not to get the vote. And so women now have the vote going into the next election. William Thompson enters the Senate, and there are Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate, and Woodrow Wilson is the president. They can finally get a lot of things done that they couldn't get done in the past. You have the opportunity to do just about anything with the majority across the board. Among the things that Woodrow Wilson does is he enacts racist policies that segregate federal offices like the IRS, and he engages in race-based dismissals of federal employees. We end up having World War I, and at the end of it, the country shuts down due to a worldwide pandemic called the Spanish flu. If anything, people, particularly the people of Kansas, are kind of tired of how things are going. And as a result, Arthur Capper defeats William Thompson by the greatest measure of anyone who's ever lost it as a sitting senator in the history of the Senate. He serves for 5 terms. He even wins in 1936 when FDR won 46 states, including Kansas. After Capper, there are 72 years of stability in this Senate seat, which include Andrew Schopel, James Pearson, Nancy Kassebaum, and Pat Roberts. And there's a lot of harmony between the senators, as shown that when Nancy Kassebaum won her election in 1978, James Pearson stepped down early so that she could be senior to all of the incoming freshman senators. Today's senator in the cursed Senate seat is Roger Marshall. He's been serving since 2021. His professional background is that he's a doctor, and he was in Congress for a few terms. Back in 2017, he was accused of violating the Stock Act of 2012. I looked a little bit into this. For those who don't know, the Stock Act says, and this is of 2012, as of 2012, congressional members are not allowed to use insider knowledge to buy stocks. I mean, this would shock you, but there was a time when those who served in Congress weren't all just brilliant stock market investors. They may or may not have used insider knowledge. We know now today that they're just really good at stocks. Well, Roger Marshall is accused of violating the Stock Act in 2017. The little bit that I've looked into it, this actually relates to stock trades that his son had made. and he did report. They were reported later than the deadline. I haven't looked that much into it. If the cursed Senate seat is going to have a curse again, this might come back around on him, but it was 7 years ago, so I'm just not sure if that's going to have any weight. All right, so now we've got a little bit of extra time, and you guys are thinking that this has been really fun. I've loved all these great stories, but have you done any math on this? Don't worry, I have. Because as I was doing this, I just thought, well, was this really an anomaly that you had 13 senators in 10 terms? I mean, I don't know what life was like in the mid 19th century. I imagine it was kind of hard. So I have Kansas in blue here, and this is the foundation of our data. They formed up in 1861. They had 13 senators in the first seat, 7 in the second, and in 58 years, they had gone through those 13 senators. And initially, I just said, well, I'm just going to find the first data from the first 2 states that came into the Union before Kansas and the next 2 states after. But the problem was that it didn't include Nebraska, which surprised me because I didn't know this. I thought Kansas and Nebraska became states at the same time. And it also didn't include Colorado, which is also a bordering state. It didn't include Iowa, which is on the border. And so I wanted to include border states as well as states that came into statehood around the time of Kansas. And what I find here, I see the highlighted ones here of California and Oregon had even worse situations. And I thought, well, why is that? And in what I can best discern in some of the cases without doing nearly the research I did into this Senate seat is I just looked at the geography. California and Oregon are on the West Coast. And it wasn't until 1869 that the Transcontinental Railroad was completed with a depot out of Sacramento. As a result, it was nearly impossible to get back and forth for some people some of the times. They might have had to take a wagon on the Santa Fe Trail for at least part of the trip. Now, during this time, California and Oregon go through about half a dozen vacancies. California has 6 retirements, 3 deaths, and 1 resignation in their first seat. Oregon has 4 retirements and 4 deaths. It just seems like people don't want this job. And I'm not saying the job was literally killing them, but I don't know. I mean, we have 4 people dead out of 17. That's a lot. If we had 4 people die in this call right now, that would be a lot. I wanted to look into the state of Washington because they're also on the West Coast. However, what I found was they didn't have their first senator until 1889. As a result, there was lots of railroads and much easier travel. They didn't get to their 13th senator until 112 years. And that's the end of this presentation. For anyone who would like to continue to follow any of my research, I would like to tell you just a little bit about it. I have my email here. I have a LinkedIn and an Instagram that I created when I started writing the Charles Curtis biography. As Trey had said earlier, my research topic for my dissertation is about the Quad Nations land treaties with the federal government. A lot of that has some of it has some overlap with the life of Charles Curtis. 3 of the treaties had occurred before he was born, but one of the treaties happened when he was a teenager, and then there was subsequent legislation that he was actually involved in as a congressman. I believe it's in March. I just got word today I've been accepted to speak at a conference at Boston University, and I'll be talking about some of the land treaties in a talk I've titled "Death a Thousand Strokes of Pen." I thank everyone for being here. I'm going to leave this up for just another minute in case anyone wants it. If you want to reach out to me, please do. I'd be glad to hear from you. Thank you so much. And now Trey is going to moderate any questions we have.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chris. That was a fascinating journey you took us on. And we've got some questions rolling in, but kind of to get us started, what's your connection to Kansas? What got you interested in this topic?
Oh, So, my my great grandfather's name is Charles Curtis, and we don't have definitive information on there being a relationship. He said he was first cousins with Vice President Charles Curtis. I don't know him to be a liar because I don't know him at all, and so I had this peripheral knowledge of the existence of Vice President Curtis. My third daughter, I have four daughters, and my third daughter is in elementary school one year, and she has to do a book report on specifically about a biography. And she knows of the existence of Charles Curtis. She wants to make that her topic. And the problem was there were no biographies written about Charles Curtis. I see behind you, you have Kitty Hamilton's book, In His Own Words. Now, that had come out just around that time, but it wasn't a biography, it was an autobiography. And so it didn't count. And the whole point of the school project was how to cite or source a biography. So it wasn't allowed. And I said, well, no problem. I'll write a biography. How long could it take? So that was in 2019. And now I'm here. I have a lot of friends in the tribe. I've been to Caw City to do interviews with people. I've been to the Kansas archives to make sure that some of the things I thought I knew were actually true. And that's my relationship to Kansas.
Excellent answer, and I love the reason why you got into that biography. That's just fantastic. I have to imagine that that happens pretty infrequently that someone's child convinces them to start their work. All right, so we have Aaron here that says, Chris, can you explain a little bit more about fusion when you talked about John Martin? Thanks, great talk.
Oh, yeah, no problem. So during the populist movement, the populists were teaming up with let's say, the minority party in some states. In Kansas, the minority party were the Democrats because the Democrats were thought to be the enemy. They were the Confederates. Whereas in a state like North Carolina, the minority party was the Republicans because the Republicans were the enemy. They were the oppressors of the South. And so you had this great enthusiasm of this new voting base of the populists and the established administration of these minority parties. And so they would sometimes fuse to have a populist Democrat or a populist Republican. And that's what it means by fusion.
Awesome, perfect. Um, what does this cursed Senate seat say about Kansas politics and Kansas itself?
So my in a conclusion I could draw was that it dealt a lot with the party bosses, and that if you didn't adhere to the party boss, you might find yourself on the way out. So, for example, we have those senators who were engaging in bribery, paying someone $15,000 not to run against them, and then they get a job as president of a bank, and then an employee from the same bank is installed. That might have been overlooked if those candidates were going to play ball. I can't say for sure in the case of those particular politicians. I didn't look into their alliances, but it had a lot to do with the the politics of the Republican Party at the time. But some of them also could have been anomalies. I think of the case of John Martin. John Martin coming in as a Democrat, the populist wave really could not be stopped in the early 1890s, but a major depression did help the tide of populism go out.
We had somebody wondering really what caused Arthur Capper to win by such a landslide. I believe you said it was like the biggest in
The
the
biggest. He won by
history of the
30.
Senate.
It was the biggest in the history, at least by that time, of a sitting U.S. senator losing. So a big part of it is that the Republican Party was very, very strong in Kansas. I think a lot of Republicans had learned a big lesson by not trying to split off into a progressive party. Instead, from there, they ended up with a progressive wing in the Republican Party, but they remained unified in many ways. Also, we think of the character of Arthur Capper. Arthur Capper was very popular. He was very well known, not just in political circles, but he was a big media person. He owned at least one really big newspaper. I believe that I know for a fact he has a magazine. It's a farming magazine called Cappers, and it's still in publication today. So he had a lot of name recognition, but also I think Kansas voters, including the women voters, that new voting base of women, they weren't going to, as a majority, they weren't going to have a Democrat in that seat at that time.
Awesome. Well, Chris, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to be with us here tonight. We greatly appreciate it, and this is definitely a unique topic in Museum After Hours programming. But
Trey, I
I
thank
wanted
you so
to
much. And everyone who came here, I thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed it.
well, thank you again, Chris. And um, I wanted to let everybody know that for our next month, we will be taking a break from Museum After Hours to prepare for a brand new in-person and virtual Museum After Hours experience that will commemorate the Kansas Historical Society's 150th anniversary. So we are going to spotlight different divisions of our agency, starting with our former executive director, Raymond Powers, who will be talking with our current executive director, Patrick Zollner, to look at the Kansas Historical Society's past, present, and future. So be sure to follow our e-newsletter, social media to stay up to date because there will definitely be more details about this to come. So from everyone here at Museum After Hours, thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you hopefully in person.